Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. In this video we're going to be deploying a Home Assistant with Docker, and I'll also share my Kubernetes deployment. But before we do that, let's go on a quick whistle-stop tour of what Home Assistant is. If you've been following my mini-series, you'll know that Home Assistant is basically the glue that binds. We have our Internet of Things devices, things like our lights, our smart switches, our temperature sensors, all of those things. They're communicating over a mesh Zigbee network, and then basically all of that is fed into Home Assistant. Home Assistant is what controls the logic, so it does things based upon things we want to happen. Click a light switch, turn the lights on, but it also has a great application for your mobile device and also a really cool web UI. Now within that as well, there are things like customized apps and community downloads where you can expand the capability of the basic default Home Assistant, so you can add things like additional graphs, additional components for other services, and a whole host of other things. Now there's not one way to deploy Home Assistant. I'm going to show you with Docker, but there are pre-built packages that are provided by Home Assistant themselves. These are effectively little SBCs that come pre-baked with Home Assistant. There are a couple of flavors of those, one being more powerful than the other and having different connectivity. So it supports different protocols, etc., and has more connectivity. Otherwise, you can go down the route that I'm showing you today, which is to containerize it, but you can also deploy it with Home Assistant operating system. So think of this as basically a Linux distribution with Home Assistant already baked into it. So it takes away any of the configuration woes and you're not going to need Docker. I obviously prefer to use Docker for all of the advantages that it provides, but you're going to need to understand Docker and have a machine available for that. Also within that, there's a couple of nuances as well. You can go with things like Home Assistant Core, which just has the core elements, or you can go down the route of having Home Assistant Supervisor, which comes with a supervisor overlay, which allows you to have sort of admin special privileges on the box and additional functionality. Now, it's quite difficult to summarize those differences in a soundbite, so please do go and have a look at the documentation and choose the version that best suits you. I'm going to be using the default Docker container with the Docker Compose from the official repository. That's the way I have this set up, and on top of that I also use HAS. This is the community store that's available for community plugins. Now these aren't obviously official, but there's a whole host of things in there that are well supported, well documented, and typically you can review all of that source code online if you want to. The reason I use that is because it has some quality of life improvements. Things like more intuitive, more highly detailed maps, and also better graphs, things like scheduling assistant, third-party support for things like your Nest thermostat and your Ring doorbell, etc., and Alexas, etc., so you can have alerts coming out of your Alexas, and a whole host more. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of community plugins. Anyway, let's have a look now at the configuration and let's get this thing up and running. So I've connected now over to my Docker virtual machine using VS Code, and I've copied over the compose and configuration file. Let's go through those, make sure we understand what's going on here. So as I quickly mentioned, in the Docker Compose, I've got my Home Assistant folder. And in the Home Assistant folder, I've got the compose file and also the configuration.yaml file. This is the configuration file for Home Assistant, which it will use on that first boot, and also any subsequent changes you need to make to the configuration file. You'll have to reload Home Assistant. Sometimes you need to actually reboot the container. You can actually edit this as well in the GUI, which is quite nice, so within Home Assistant itself, but for those who want to just stick with the YAML file in something like a text editor, you can also do that. We will need to move this configuration file from here, or at least change the Docker Compose file that I've created to reference this configuration file here. It's entirely up to you. You'll just need to tweak the volume section in the Docker Compose file. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Compose file, find out exactly what's going on in here. So the first thing to note in this setup is I'm using 2 containers. You don't have to. You can use it just with Home Assistant, and if you do that, it will use SQLite. That's basically a single file database, which is okay to get things up and running and if you want to just test this out, but you're going to run into performance issues later down the line, especially as you get more devices and more logging. It just doesn't scale very well. So to remedy that, I've gone down the recommended route of adding a PostgreSQL database, and you can see here that we're using Postgres 16.3. I'll come on to that in a moment. So let's go back to the top and let's have a look at how I've got Home Assistant set up. So the key things here are we're specifying a few volumes, we've got a dependency on the database, and we've got some traffic rules here so that we can put this behind a reverse proxy. So if we go into detail here, I'm pulling from the GitHub container repository and I'm pulling a Home Assistant stable version. So this will always pull the most recent stable version. You can change this if you want, but it makes sense to keep it as stable for obvious reasons. I'm mounting 2 volumes here. Now, I just mentioned that configuration file. So basically anything we put in my instance is in my home directory /docker/home assistant and then a config folder. In there, I'm going to put the configuration.yaml file. This is also then mapped to the configuration file within Home Assistant when it boots, and there'll be a ton more files that are created in this repository. Also, we're going to put in the local time, so this will sync the container to the local time of the host machine. I've put in my environment variable for where I'm based, and I've said to restart unless stop. So if this fails or the machine boots up and you didn't specifically tell it to shut down, it should restart, should start up again. Now I've commented out the ports section because I'm going to be putting this behind a reverse proxy, so I can use this on port 443 and have a nice SSL certificate and URL. But if you don't have a reverse proxy set up, you're not quite there yet in having that sorted, you can uncomment this part here and comment out all of the labels section, and you'll be able to access this traditionally using the IP address of your Docker host. In my case, it's that 200.50 and then port 8123, which is the default for Home Assistant. We're going to have 2 networks here, and again, if you're not using a proxy, you can get rid of the proxy network. Remember, you will need to change this from proxy to whatever your traffic network is on. And I've also created a separate network for Home Assistant, but that's specifically for communication between this container and the database, and that is an internal Docker network only, so nothing outside of it can access. So that's good for security. Now, it depends on that database being available. As I've said, we're making Home Assistant use an external database, so we want to make sure that that database is available before we do anything else on Home Assistant. If that's not available, you're not going to get all of your graphs and historical data. I do believe the container still works though, even if the database isn't available, and that's good because you still want basic functionality like things like the lights, etc. to work even when the database isn't available. So there's nothing too exciting here for the labels. This is the same as pretty much all of my setups. The only thing here is obviously I've specified that port 8123, which is the default. I've also added the security option of no new privileges and set that to true. Now we get on to the database, and after checking it says that this is compatible with any Postgres version greater than or equal to 12. So I've just bumped this up to the latest stable version, which is 16.3. Called it Home Assistant-DB, and we'll use that in a little while. Again, I've told it to restart unless stopped, and then I've set some usernames, passwords, and the database name itself. You will need to take note of these, and we'll put these in the configuration file in a moment. And there's also an important set here to make sure that the database encodes the database with UTF-8. Now for this volume, again, you can modify this to your requirements. I've just put it in that Home Assistant folder again in a /schemas folder. And what that's going to do is basically store the database. We've put this one just on the Home Assistant network, so it's not on the proxy network, so it's not externally accessible. It's only accessible via the Home Assistant Docker container. I've also set then as well the security option to no new privileges. At the bottom, we've specified our networks. We've said that the proxy is an external network because that network was created outside of this Docker Compose file. And we've then got the Home Assistant network, which is created within this Docker Compose file. So that's it. That's the Docker Compose file. The next bit we want to look at is obviously that configuration file. Now, bear in mind when we look at this, we've set here the Home Assistant user and the password, you'll need to make sure that these match up. So when we go into the configuration.yaml, this gives you basically a carbon copy of what mine looks like. And I've commented out some of the bits that probably aren't relevant, but I've left them in because it gives you an idea of what the format looks like. Obviously, do go and check all of the official documentation, and usually there's documentation with any other third-party integrations. Do bear in mind, as I said, if you don't want to edit in here, you can do this through the Home Assistant GUI. So all I've done here is I've set the default config. I've enabled text-to-speech if that's something that you want. I've specified my MQTT sensors. That's from an earlier video. Now, the reason I've done that is because I use it for this, my little pipe eco with a particulate sensor on it. And because there's no out-of-the-box support for that, I basically had to create a number of sensors here and set them to what the MQTT spits out when it's connected to Home Assistant. Don't worry too much about that if you're new to all this, but just understand that it has the capability, flexibility to be able to create all of your own sensors entirely customized to how you want, and then you can display them on your dashboard however you want. So I'm going to skip through all these sensors, but it gives you an idea of what's possible. Once we get past that, I've left in the MFA module. So here you can add multi-factor authentication to your Home Assistant, which is obviously a good idea, especially if you're going to allow this to be externally accessible. A lot of people do that. I don't do that. I make sure that my split tunnel VPN on my phone is always available, so I've basically got a connection back home all the time. Thanks to my new internet as well, that behaves a lot better. Now, if you are using a proxy, you're going to have to add this section here. If you don't add this section here, it's going to complain in the logs that it's routing traffic from an unknown location or untrusted location. I forget the wording. Basically, you need to use forwarded for true, so it knows where the traffic came from, and then you can set your trusted proxies. I've left a few in here just so you can tweak this to your liking. You can have a singular IP address here. You could also have, say, a subnet as well. This one here, 172, is typically because my Docker containers are residing in that network, so that's that internal Docker network. And I've also added 10.0.8, and that was from my Kubernetes instance where all my pods run in a 10/8. The IP ban enabled is true, and the login attempts is 5. So basically, if an IP address logs in incorrectly 5 times, it will ban them. I think it's for about an hour. Next, you can also then include other YAML files, and you do that by doing this. You say what it is: a group, an automation, a script, and a scene. Don't worry too much about what those are. Those are terms within Home Assistant. You can have groups of devices. You can have automations. That's pretty much what it says on the tin. Every hour, do something, or when this happens, do that. You can have scripts, which are like a traditional script, and you can set scenes as well, which sort of create different environments based on polling, collating multiple things together. Now, you can also have devices that you specify. So, for example, here, my Samsung TV, that's the IP address for that, and I've called it Samsung TV, so it will create now a sensor, an entity called Samsung TV. Same for my WebOS for my LG TV. I've also set up Notify, so I can get notified via my SMTP. So I can get notified by SMTP of anything that's happening on my Home Assistant. So that can be whatever event you want to be notified on. And again, that comes into the realm of that full customization, making use of those automations. You could say, for example, tell me if it sees movement in front of my house. Tell me when the temperature in a room drops below 10 degrees. I don't know, whatever you want. That's the beauty of Home Assistant. And the final line is the recorder. So this is basically the record, i.e. the database. And you'll notice at the bottom we specify a DB URL. And now, because of the beauty of Docker, we can actually say that instead of using an IP address, we can use Home Assistant-DB, which in the Docker Compose file is the name of the container. And if you remember, Docker can use container names as DNS. Now, the important thing here is we specify the user we created in the database, so that was Home Assistant user, and we use the password that was in the Docker Compose file. Great. So you'll basically now want to configure this configuration file to your requirements along with the Docker Compose file. And for this to work with my mappings, I'm going to go up and I'm going to create a folder within Docker, and I'm going to create home-assistant. In Home Assistant, it expects to have a config file. So I'm going to create a new folder called config. So within this config file that I've just created, I'm going to go down here, I'm going to right click, I'm going to copy that, and then I'll paste it into this folder here. So now within Home Assistant /config, we've got the configuration file, and now we're ready to start spinning up this container. Now, just as a quick update, I have gone through that configuration file and I've just commented out anything that I think might cause an issue for this demonstration. Obviously, when you've got a bit more time, you can go through this and tweak it to your liking. But let's now hop into the terminal and navigate to the Docker Compose folder, and let's get this container up and running. Okay, so with the terminal open, I'm going to change directory to Docker Compose /Home Assistant. And do a quick ls. Yeah, we've got that Docker Compose file, and we've got the configuration file which we copied over to our Home Assistant /config folder. So now we're ready to run Home Assistant. So if we do a sudo docker compose up-d, that's going to go away and it's going to pull the container. Thankfully now with my fast internet, I can actually do this in real time and it doesn't take all eternity. So that's gone down now and it's pulled the Home Assistant container. Once it's pulled the container, it will do the database, then it'll extract it, and fingers crossed it's going to have this up and running. In the meantime, I'm going to fire up Portainer just because I find it much easier to use to monitor logs, and we're going to check that for the container to be created, and we'll check for any error messages within the startup. If you do have error messages when it starts up, common things will be you've got an error in your configuration file and you may have an error with connecting to your database. Typically it can't be found, or you've got the wrong username and password. So brilliant, that's started already. Hopping into Portainer, let's have a look what we've got. So over in Portainer, I'm going to click on the containers. You'll see here now we've got 2 green running signs. That's good news. Let's have a look at the database. That all looks fine. The system is up and running and ready to accept connections. Fantastic. And if we go to Home Assistant, fingers crossed there's no errors here. So starting successfully, started, everything's up and running and there's no errors. So now hopefully you're good to go. Now if you're not using the reverse proxy, go to your Docker IP address and port 8123. If you are using the traffic proxy, do make sure that you've set a DNS record in your DNS resolver. I've done this earlier in Pi-hole. So now hopefully I'm going to open up a new incognito window. And if I now go to Home Assistant, hopefully we're greeted with the welcome page. Whew. Excellent. Right, so this is the welcome page, and if you've got this far, excellent, you're probably well on the way now. So we want to create the smart home. So we're going to create an account. I'll just call it James. I'll use Jim's Garage as a super secret password. And we're ready to create our account. Now, for some reason, it thinks I'm in Amsterdam, even though I set the time zone to be London, but we'll go with Amsterdam. Why not? It's a cool city. So Netherlands, and we'll click next. I'm not going to send off any data to them. So click next, and then we can hit finish. Now, I did have this error earlier. Not entirely sure what's happening. Something to do with a bad redirect. But if you just delete that and then hit return, you should go back to the login page. Now we can log in with our username. And we're in. So now this is basically it. You're up and running, and you now have your blank canvas to create whatever it is that you want to create. So I'll provide a whistle-stop overview of this fresh installation, and then I'll give a quick view of my Home Assistant, albeit I'll have to redact some stuff, so you can have an idea of what it might look like in the future. So key things that you want to know really are basically down in the settings. You want to go into the settings, and then there's loads of things that you can configure which really bring Home Assistant to life. So Home Assistant Cloud is kind of like their paid version where you can get, I think it's called Casa OS, and it basically gives you Home Assistant in the cloud. I don't use that because I access this remotely and self-host it. Devices and services is important, so this is basically when you create things. So you'll see Google Text-to-Speech here. Remember, we specified that in the configuration file. So anything in there that you create should show up here as either an integration, a device, or an entity. So by default, the only device I've got is the sun, and that's because you can do things based upon the sun time. It's pretty cool. You could have blinds in your house that go up when the sun rises, things like that, or conversely goes down at night, whichever way around you would want it. You then have entities, which are kind of not really devices, i.e. a device would probably be something like a phone, whereas an entity is more like a sensor, so an order of magnitude in terms of complexity, system complexity, etc. And then you've got some helpers. I don't actually use any helpers. Now, by default, this is kind of what it looks like, and we'll add some new things in a minute and just have a quick play. Outside of the devices and services, we've got the automations. So remember when I mentioned that you could include automation scenes, scripts, blueprints.yaml? If you did that, that's where these would show up here. And then you can tweak them, modify them within the browser, and use them in the rest of Home Assistant. So one thing that's also really cool in the integrations, I'll move my lovely face out of the way, is if you click in the bottom here, you click Add Integrations. Now this is where you're going to see all of the things that you're really familiar with. So you can have plugins with AccuWeather. You can show the weather for where you are in real time. You can have AdGuard, so you can get the stats for your AdGuard. You can get your Amazon orders. I'm not going to go through all these. There are literally hundreds of these things. And these are the ones that are supported, or at least kind of official integrations. This isn't even the community repository, which has this probably times 100. So one thing that you might want to get straight away, I'm trying to be as agnostic as possible here because I don't know what you're running. If we wanted to do a speed test. So we could create a speedtest.net. Do you want to start the setup? I do. Now, the area relates to a notion within Home Assistant. Basically, you create areas in Home Assistant that might replicate areas in your house. So you could have outside, front of the house, back of the house, bedroom, you name it. So I'm going to leave that as default, which puts it in no area. And now that's been added. So when I added that, you saw here that it's been populated. So now I have one integration and it's created one service. So if I now click on that, you'll see one service and it's created this service here, this speedtest.net. It hasn't created any automations, scenes or scripts, but it has created some sensors. Now you can add those to the dashboard, or you can go to the overview here, and then that's now been added to this default dashboard. By default, I believe it's dynamic. So when you add integrations, it will dynamically populate this. You can customize it, and that's what I do. So you get full control over your dashboard, but it's a little bit more involved and you're going to have to take some time to learn what that looks like. All the documentation is obviously available on their website. Now, this isn't actually working. We'll get that working in a minute. But what's really cool with Home Assistant is you can pretty much click on all of this stuff here and it will pop up a graph. That graph doesn't exist yet because it hasn't done a ping, but let's go and fix that now through our friends, the automations. So the way to get that up and running is we can go to settings and we can go to automations. We'll create a new automation and we're going to create a new one. Now I'm going to add a trigger here, and it's going to be a time and location, and it's going to be a time pattern because I want this to happen at a specific interval. So you can choose obviously calendar tied to the sun or a specific date. I'll do that one, and I'm going to say every, let's make it interesting for this video, let's say every 30 seconds it's going to do a speed test. So now that's the trigger set. I don't need any and if or then do, but if anyone's familiar with things like if this then that, you kind of understand again how simple this is to build really complex and cool stuff. For instance, I have things where only certain things will happen at night, and it will make sure that lights turn off in the day, those sorts of things. I can overrule them with a button, but by default they don't come on, which is great for energy saving, etc. So we're going to save that now, this automation. Let's just call it, I don't know, speed test. And I'll save that. Now what we need to do is to actually do an action. So all we've said is trigger this automation every 30 seconds, but it's not actually going to do anything. That's because we need to do an action. Now what I need it to do is to go down to other actions, and it needs to call a service. Now the service I need to call, and if you click on it you get them all and you can kind of scroll through it. I need the Home Assistant update entity. So Home Assistant dot update entity. There it is. And we don't need to choose any targets for this because it's just going to update this entity. So I'm going to click save, and now fingers crossed that should be running. So I don't know if it runs exactly when you create it or it's going to run it in 30 seconds, but hopefully I'll wait 30 seconds and this will update. So whilst we're waiting for that, if I hit the pencil, I think I can click the 3 dots and then take control. Yeah, so this is now going to give me complete control of the dashboard. So great. Now I can actually click on this entity and we can move it around. We can do things like click the minus and it will put it over on this side. Great. So I'm going to click done and save that. And you can also now go into the code editor. So if you click the pencil, you can actually hit the 3 dots again, and then you can see the raw configuration entity editor. And that's what I mentioned earlier, and you can actually put that in the default config if you want as well. So okay, great, we've had our first automated speed test. Now, I don't have much luck with this speed test CLI. For whatever reason, it always seems to max out at about 1 gig, even though it's capable of 2 gig. But anyway, that's beside the point. It shows that we've now got a integration working, we've got some entities, and now if we click on this, actually if we had a couple, we'd get some graphs here. So I'll fast forward ahead in a minute and we'll see some graphs. So we'll come back to this in a minute when it's run a few more times, but let's go back into the settings. So we'd looked at the automation. Then we can look at the areas. So yeah, you could create things like your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room, and then you can drop all of the entities and sensors into these areas, and then you can make things based upon the location itself. You can add labels to things and then create zones. Zones can be things as well based upon proximity. So you can actually do some really cool things if you get your mobile phone. So you can add your mobile phone to Home Assistant. You do that easily by connecting via the app. So download the app off the Play Store or the iOS store. Once you log in with your account, it will basically create a load of sensors in Home Assistant. And if you allow it to do things like share your GPS, you can do things based upon your proximity. So what's cool is if you've got things like a security system or an alarm, you could actually say disable that when I'm at home and arm it when I'm not at home. I don't know if people are brave enough to do that, but that obviously gives you some context. You could do things that are less about security in terms of make sure the outside lights are on and then turn them off when you're in, those sorts of things. Back into the settings, then we've got the different dashboards. So the one we've just created was that overview, which was this one here. You've then got the map, which we've already seen, and then you've got things like energy. So if you've got things like a smart meter, you can actually plug this into Home Assistant for many of the big providers, and then you can actively map your usage. So if you've got loads of power sapping devices, you can also set up then things like notifications through that SMTP we saw, and you'll get notifications of what's draining the power and, well, however you want to get that configured. Next, we've got the logbook, which shows kind of everything that's going on, and that's really handy for debugging sensors. We've also got the history, so this could be the changes of any different kind of entity you've got. You can see here that I've now got that one speed test. Then we've got the media, so any media sources that you want to put into here, so you can actually have photos and things on it. And then it comes with a simple to-do list if you wanted to use that as well. Other things we can do is set up things like voice assistants. So you can add in things like your Google or your Alexa. I think this one costs to do it officially, but there is a third-party integration that you can use, and I've had some success with that. That's quite cool because you can do things like say, hey Alexa, turn on my lights. Sorry for all the people I've just turned on your lights, but you get the idea. You can basically use this to control your home, and you can also do it on the flip side. So you can actually get notifications out through your devices. So for example, you can plug in, say if you wanted a camera event, it detects somebody, it could make a noise, or it could flash your lights, etc. You can set up things like NFC tags and QR codes if you're doing something fancy and you've got one of those readers. You can have multiple people that use this, so you could set up basically profiles for different people. An example of this would be you would have one person per mobile device application, and then you would have a load of sensors for everybody's device. You could track where people are, and you could do things based upon proximity, etc. Give people access to different areas of Home Assistant, those sorts of things. The system is basically where we do some of the management of the underlying HA, and we've got general, so change your time settings, update, add-ons, all of that stuff, repairs, logs, do some backups, not really needed because we're going to be backing up Docker anyway, network, and then some hardware. So you can click on here, and if there's any, so you can click on here and see some of your details on your hardware. This is obviously going to look a bit funky because it's virtualizing a container. The one other bit that's really important is the developer tools. Now in the developer tools, you start off on the YAML tab. You can check your configuration, so if you're doing any tweaks in the background and you want to check that you've got a valid configuration file, you can click this button and it will either say yay or nay. Next, you can decide if you want to just reload certain parts of Home Assistant without rebooting the whole thing. Most things you can actually just reboot that section without taking out Home Assistant, but there are things like the configuration file that sometimes do require a full reboot. So you can go through those and have a look. You can also have a look at the states of all your sensors. So for example here, you can see the state of that sensor is set to 667. That's the result of the last test that I did. You can see the services that you've got configured here. So you've got some templates here, and this allows you to basically create your own custom templates to show in your dashboard how you want. We've got some events here, so you can actually do some debugging. So in here, for example, you could create a simulation of, you would find the entity name for this switch, you would create a fire event, and then you would see what happens. So this is a good way for testing automations without actually having to do them in real time. You can get some statistics for all of the different sensors and entities you've got, and then there's an assist piece which I don't actually use. So that's a whistle-stop tour of Home Assistant from a basic default installation. Now you should have all of the tools that you require to go away and create this for yourself. Now if we hop into my Home Assistant, and apologies for redacting some of the sensitive data, you can see how I've got this set up. Now I'm by no means a Home Assistant aficionado. There's people with some amazing dashboards out there. I don't know how long it will take them. I'm quite a humble user of home automation anyway. I don't tend to go too deep down that rabbit hole, but it's something that I'm looking into. So here, for example, you can see I've got the speed test, and if I click on this one, you can see that I've now got some graphs that have gone on throughout the day. Again, highly dependent on which server you're using, what time of the day, etc. But if that's of interest to you, it's something that you could track over time. I've got the energy sensors all plugged in here, and now I'm taking use, and now I'm bearing the fruits of having those MSO1s, which is awesome. I've created a custom dashboard, so at the top you'll see I've got different icons for different things. So if I click on my spanner, some of these aren't actually up and running yet because I've reinstalled applications and I've not changed the API keys. But on here, for example, I just integrated with Pi-hole to see how many ads I was blocking. Didn't really use it, and it's not really that important. I can just check in the dashboard or on my homepage. But what is quite important are the battery levels. So ignore these two because I don't actually have those any longer. But this will tell me all the battery levels of my sensors for my motion sensor. So I've only got 3% left on my garage sensor. So once that dies, my lights aren't going to automate when I walk in and turn off when I walk out. After that, I've got Frigate integrated into my Home Assistant, so I can click here. I've got the front and the back, and then my Ring doorbell as well. Ring doorbell's here in the middle, and I don't currently have these working at the moment, but I do have some door sensors, which was really useful for the kids. I want to make sure that if the kids were in the house, the doors were locked because they're young and they don't want to run outside. This one's quite useful. If you're into that, it will kind of tell you when there's motion events. Quite noisy because the Ring doorbell's a bit dumb. It doesn't have any AI, but the movement events on my actual camera, which have the Coral TPU, or at least did, now use the iGPU, that is more sensitive to things that I actually care about, i.e. people. Then I've got some temperature sensors for around the house. The Pico is actually uninstalled at the moment. It's not plugged in, so that's why these particulate, humidity and pressure aren't there, but you can see the temperatures throughout the rest of the house, and you can see over time what that looks like. And if you wanted to drill in, you could click on a specific temperature thermometer device and you'd get that for whatever time period you want. You can obviously show more and then choose a custom history for how long you wanted it. So for example, let's go for this month. There you can see the temperature of my garage over the past month. What's cool is, being in the UK, it never gets too hot and it never gets too cold, which kind of between 16 and 20s, more than enough for me, means I get to wear nice jumpers all the time. Coming out of there, I've then got my lights. So if I click this button here, it should go dark. And then if I click it again, it should go light. I've got some light events, so I can see basically when the lights turned on and off. Not really of much use, but it's good to know when the cat came in and out, etc. Or if you had the kids walking around, you can see if they got up, etc. Light levels, again, might be useful if you've got things like blinds and you want to tie a blind closing to however light the sensor is recording. And then finally, I've got my media. Again, most of this stuff isn't configured at the moment. I need to tweak it and update API keys and IP addresses because I've migrated now over to OpenSense and I haven't put all those DNS, all those MAC addresses back in. But effectively, I can then control all of the TVs and my Denon smart speakers and all that sort of stuff remotely through HA, which is kind of cool. The one other thing I set up was that community repository, and that's the Home Assistant Community Store, or HACS. Now, HACS is really good, so it enables things like Frigate, and as I mentioned, that Alexa media player, that's that third-party integration, which doesn't require a paid subscription, to use your Alexas as both a inbound and an outbound sound system. Now, if you click on the integrations here and click Explore and Download Repositories, you'll see that there's a ton more stuff in here, absolutely tons of stuff, third parties, etc. And there's both those integrations and there's some front end stuff. So I'm going to dismiss the new stuff, but these are all things that are custom for the front end. And again, if you click Explore, there's tons of stuff in here. Things like these graphs here, these look a bit nicer, bit better on the eye. Those are actually through HACS. They're not part of the default installation. The default installation has graphs that look like this, but these are a bit nicer at a glance. They're more averaged and rounded, but you can obviously choose what you want. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough, so thanks for bearing with me on that. Let me know if this is something that you're going to use and what you've got planned for it. I'm going to continue going down this route on this series because I think there's a ton more stuff to explore. I've just showed you kind of what I've set up a few years ago, and it's well overdue for me to refresh this. So do let me know in the comments any thoughts, ideas, and what you'd like to see. And as always, if you've liked this video, hit the thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.